This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, everybody. We're back from a week's hiatus. Also back from me forgetting to record the session before. So what we'll do at the very beginning of this one is cover just a couple of things to catch everybody up to make sure that you all know what we're talking about, because this session is a continuation of the one that we had done before. So we get to dive right into things. If I can get my screen up. There we go. What we left off doing was talking about the nature of correspondences as opposed to correspondence lists or connection lists or lists of correlations. The problem is that these lists are always one-on-one. And so the idea is that what we want to be able to do as we explain the Book of Mormon and try to put the Book of Mormon in a historical context is to find places in which more of these pieces and threads start to line together. So we want, not only can we find some place that has something that we're interested in, but we want to look at specific places that the Book of Mormon says that it might be at the time period that it says the Book of Mormon people were there, and see if there are things in the text that would reflect what we know was going on in that location at that time. So I'm going to review a couple of them, and then we'll start up where we left off last week. So the first place that everything starts is in this Mesoamerican area. The question is, where do we begin? Well, in 600 BC, where we begin is with them landing on a coast. So they're going to land somewhere down on this coast of Guatemala. And we know that there were people up in the foothills. Somebody saw them advancing a sail. The sail was going to be seen for a long period of time. Somebody saw it, and quite likely that they were met on the beach as the ship came in. But from there, they go up, and Nephi says when he leaves his brethren, they go up, and in the Book of Mormon, up, down, over, they tend to indicate elevation rather than the cardinal points. So there was no concept of going up as being north. It was always elevation. One of the ways we know this is that we know that the land of Nephi is south of the land of Zarahemla, but you always go up to the land of Nephi and you always go down to the land of Zarahemla. So these things are telling us the general location. So the Nephites have come up, and now we're looking in this area about 600 BC at this region, which is Highland Guatemala, and we want to know kind of what's going on in that period and how it correlates with the Book of Mormon. So what you'll see is several of these things, and the one that's highlighted in yellow is where I left off. So with the one where I left off, that's where you're going to find the new information. So the very first thing is, as I mentioned before, at least 6 villages are there. We know that there's about 6,000 people who could have seen them land. He always goes up to that Highland Guatemala. The other thing we know about that area at that time of the world is linguistically and culturally Maya. So as they're moving into that area, they're moving into a Maya culture. Why is that important? Well, you've got a group of, let's say, 30. Give it a number, 30, 50, which is way outside. But if on the outside number, let's say you've got 50 Nephites who came over from the old world and ended up in Highland Guatemala. The question is, who is going to influence whom? Now, you've got to be able to make your own food. You've got to be able to make your own clothes. There's no indication that anybody in the company of Lehi was a potter. There was no indication that they knew very much about making their own clothes. They were relatively wealthy. They probably could purchase a lot of different things when they were in Jerusalem. Plus, this is a new territory. There are new lands. There's new places, new different types of food. Somebody's going to have to teach them how to eat. So they're going to start merging with the people who are there. And although it is certain that they're going to bring with them at least Hebrew and Egyptian, they're not going to get along very well if they insist on speaking Hebrew and Egyptian to all of those people who are speaking some version of a Maya language, probably Chontal actually. So what we have in this location is a Maya culture, and the culture, the language, that location is going to begin to influence the people in the Book of Mormon. Now, the next thing, we were looking at why did the people want a king? And the quick answer to that is that in this time period in the Highland Guatemala, the archaeologists have traced the development of kingship. And things are moving in this time period where some are moving before, some moving a little bit after, but there is a movement afoot to be able to move villages and small towns and start to consolidate them and to develop the attributes of what we will then learn to be Maya kingship. So why would they want a king? Well, everybody else has got a king. We'd like to have a king. We want to be just as good as everybody else. And so there was cultural, institutional pressure on the Nephites to have a king. So why do they want a king even if Nephite doesn't want one? Well, everybody else has got one, so we want to have one too. We talked about the other kinds of pressures that are going to be on Jacob and Nephi, and particularly Jacob when he's giving this sermon. He gives a sermon at the mount, and he says, or a sermon in front of the temple, and he says, you know, there's two things I'm going to get mad at you about. One's polygamy, and the other is costly apparel. And so the question really becomes, why is he mad about both of those things simultaneously? To a modern reader, those things seem really quite different. And it turns out, again, that in this area of the world, the archaeologists had developed this theory of how social hierarchies began, and they called it an aggrandizer. And so what was happening at this period of time is people were creating more goods to trade. Trade good allows interconnections with the other locations. And along with trade, you get more trade if you have more goods to trade, and that leads to pressures to have larger families, which means a larger productive unit that is beholding to the same father of the family. And so in this area of the world, archaeologists tell us that that's what was happening, is that people were creating hierarchical societies. They were doing it by developing these trade networks and doing it by having larger families and polygamy as part of one of the features. So again, why is this a particular interest for Jacob at this point in time? Because it's an interest in that area of the world at that point in time. All right, now that brings us down to the place where we're going to start the new information for tonight. And that new information starts off with, why does Mosiah leave the land of Nephi? It is always one thing to read the text of the Book of Mormon and to say, well, it happened because it happened. There is no history of the world that happens because it happens. There are always factors that are involved. There's social, there's economic, there's lots of reasons that things happen, but they don't just happen so that people can write a good scriptural book about them. That isn't the reason behind them. So in particular, this story has some important artifacts or pieces of information about it. So in the Book of Mormon, what do they tell us about the story? In the Book of Mormon, what they tell us about the story is the Lord comes to Mosiah and says to Mosiah, get the heck out, the Lamanites are coming and they're going to take over. And so there is a major Lamanite invasion that is coming, and the Lord warns Mosiah, and so Mosiah takes some people and he leaves. So the text tells us why they left. They left because there was a foreign army coming in, and one of the results of this foreign army coming in was that people, or many people who would follow Mosiah, so not everyone, but many who would follow Mosiah, left and would go to the land of Zarahemla. We can't date this precisely because at this point in time, the Book of Mormon doesn't give us enough dates to know exactly when this is, but we're running 200, 250 BC, somewhere in that ballpark, to be able to count out what's happening. And what linguistics and archaeology tells us is that at that time period, somewhere 200 and 250 AD, or BC, excuse me, somewhere between 200 and 250 BC, there was an invasion of Quichean speakers into Highland Guatemala. And the result of this invasion of Quichean speakers was that a formal royalty was kicked out and that the population that was previously there was dispersed. So archaeology and linguistics are telling us in that location at this particular time that there was an invasion and that people were dispersed. The Book of Mormon is saying at that location and in this time, there was an invasion and people were dispersed. That ties together text and location pretty tightly. So when we look back at the Book of Mormon and we say, okay, we're only looking at the time period from 600 BC to 200 BC, and that time period when they're in Highland Guatemala, there are several features of what we know was happening during those time periods where we can say, yes, this looks like what we see in the Book of Mormon is easily a reflection of what we know was happening in that area and at that point in time. So now we move to the next one. We're looking at correspondences in the Book of Mosiah. Now, the Book of Mosiah, of course, is a little complicated because the Book of Mosiah is named for Mosiah the grandfather. So Mosiah, Benjamin's father and grandfather to Mosiah, who comes later. We've lost anything really about this Mosiah in his own book because we lost the beginning of the book. As an aside, Royal Skousen has said that we lost 2 chapters, but he bases that on numbers that we get out of the printer's manuscript. And the printer's manuscript shows how that error occurred and how it was corrected. And so it didn't come from the original, it came from the printers, which means we really don't know how many chapters were lost. When I did the book on Labor Diligently to Write, I speculated on what kinds of things should have been in that book and should have been the parts that we lost. So if you're interested in that, it's in there somewhere. So on Interpreter Site, volume 35. So now what's happening? What happens is we now have a couple of different areas of the world that we have to start looking at. So we have now moved away from the area that is down in Highland Guatemala, where you see the name Nephi and Jerusalem, Mormon, Nephi, etc. So that's where everything was up until about 200 BC. Now they have left and they go down to Zarahemla. And the definition of Zarahemla is on a river, it's on the Sidon River. And in the model that I'm using, that becomes the Grijalva River. For those of you who might try to look it up, it has been dammed, and most of the area through this river valley where we might suspect would have been the heartland of the Book of Mormon for 500 or 600 years is now under a very large lake. And so we're not going to learn any more about that area than what we had learned before. There were some excavations done prior to the time that they flooded it, but now that it's flooded, we've kind of lost the information. So that is this land of Zarahemla. That's where they move and that's where their influence is. But in the Book of Mosiah, we're going to hear about some other kinds of things that are happening. And so we get some of this more northern area that is also going to come into play. This more northern area is the land of the Jaredites and probably the landing place of the Mulekites. So the presumption of the Mulekites is they would have landed somewhere up on this coast and then eventually followed the Grijalva River down to end up in Zarahemla, but they came, in a different direction. So that's the geography that we're looking at. And again, the time period is about BC 200. Where are we going? Yeah, BC 200, 200 BC. So now, what do we get? Yeah, I've got the times wrong because this is past 200. Anyway, so we'll go back and what kinds of things can we answer about the Book of Mormon based on this piece of geography? Now, let me back up for a second because we're going to start with Mulekites. Up in this area is where we think the Mulekites would have landed. This area is also Jaredite land. And so the Jaredites and the Mulekites are the remnants of the Jaredites. And anytime we talk about remnants of the Jaredites, it's very similar to remnants of the Nephites. In those final battles, it says everybody was destroyed, but no text actually means that. We should never take an historical text that says everybody was destroyed. That's a little bit hyperbole and is not to be assumed to be historically accurate. And in fact, in the Book of Mormon, even before we get to Cumorah, it says there are a lot of Nephites who have dissented away to the Lamanites, so they've become Lamanites. They were still, Nephites up until the point they left. And then you get to Cumorah, and they said, yeah, more people dissented away, so they became Lamanites. So people were left over. They were simply assumed into the other peoples who were there and given a different label. But there were some people who continued. So when the Mulekites arrived, there is no chance that they arrived in an empty world anymore than when the Nephites did. And in fact, it was probably an even more populous region of the world when they arrived. So they start up here, and they would have had the same kind of issue that the Nephites did. They had a smaller population. They're being integrated into a larger population. They're going to end up speaking a different language. And of course, if they're melded into the people here, one of the things that would happen over time, and you remember that they left somewhere ballparkish of 600 BC. They left after the Nephites. But you've had about 400 years worth of time that you've had these Mulekites in the New World. And they have been somewhere either starting up here in this post-Jaredite world or moving down into the valley here. And so they absorbed into, for 400 years, the cultures that were there. So now we go back and ask, why did the Mulekites lose their God? Well, they merged into the religions that were already there and eventually adopted those religions rather than being faithful to their God. So at some point in time, by the time the Mulekites get there, the Jaredites had lost their God. There's all kinds of idolatry, and the regular Mesoamerican religions are going on. And so they lose their God, and they lose their religion because they merge in with the peoples who are already there. Why did they lose their language? Well, that's another one that's kind of interesting because, of course, it was 400 years of separation. But 400 years of separation is enough for perhaps a dialect. So we might get differences between, let's say English in England and the United States and Australia, where we use different words for different things. So there are times when we may have to stop and translate for each other to make sure that we're talking about the same thing. But in general, we're still speaking the same language. We can still understand each other. We just have to work out a few little details. And 400 years just doesn't change much more than that. So it isn't time for them to have completely morphed into a completely different language, unless they have merged into a people and they began speaking the language that was there. And so I would hypothesize that that's exactly what happened, is they merged with the people that were there and that they were part of this new culture. So now we have them doing that. Why couldn't they speak to the Nephites? Well, the Nephites had either Hebrew or they had Maya, at least those two languages. But what happened, if we come back to this one, is the Nephites came down here and hit a Maya language. Coming up through here, they're going to hit either Michesoke, or by the time they start splitting, it eventually became Soke that comes down into this region. And so it starts in a region that has a completely different language. Soke is not a Maya language, and they're completely mutually unintelligible. So we're speaking English and Russian here without any loan words to speak of. So they really would come down into this area. And in the area of Zarahemla, you would have Soke speakers in that area that are now meeting with either the Hebrew or the Maya, it didn't matter which, but the Soke speakers are simply not going to understand them. So by placing the Book of Mormon in this particular context, we can find a reason for that. Now, we also find that it wasn't much longer before, let's say 250 BC, that the Soke speakers had moved and migrated into this area. And at least in my reading of the Mulekites and Zarahemla, Zarahemla is named for its king, Zarahemla, who is still alive. Mormon will explain that the habit was to name things after the founder. So although it's possible that this Zarahemla was named for an earlier founder, excuse me, much more likely that what we have is that this founder is the one who is still there. So again, we've got the archaeological evidence that prior to somewhere in the ballpark, let's say 250 BC, we've got a movement of Sokean speakers up the Grijalva River Valley, and they place themselves in a location where somebody coming down from the land of Zarahemla could find them. And we did find in the archaeological evidence before they flooded the area that there were indications of some contact between the Maya region and that Soke region. So we know that there was a connection. Now, I'm not going to suggest that the connection was made because of Mosiah going there. I think it is rather that Mosiah went there because there was already a trading connection and that he had some hope that there would be a friendly people at the end of it. And the witness of that was that there had been some trade going on. But again, all of those dates, all of those locations, very specific kinds of things are all fitting together in time and place to tell us that this is a location that still fits for the Book of Mormon. Next one, translating with a stone. So when we get to Zarahemla, they bring this stone that they retrieve from the land of Coriantumr, and it tells of the tale of Coriantumr. So there's two things that are really important. One of them is the fact that it is a stone that they bring that has the story of a king. Now, as proof that this was a connection to a Mesoamerican region, it isn't terribly good proof. However, as a connection that fits in time and space, the fact that regnal histories, king histories, were written on stelae in this area and preserved in both art and text tells us that this is a very plausible story in that time period and in that context. Now, we don't know what the language was. They said they could not read it. So perhaps they didn't have the text. We don't know whether or not the people in Zarahemla were literate with whatever their text was. But it's also possible that it was a stone that simply had carvings on it and there was no text to read. You had to read the images, and if you didn't know the background, it was harder to read because it was just a picture. So how they get them translated is that Mosiah has a seer stone and uses the seer stone to translate what's there. So now we have a seer stone. What's this seer stone doing in Mesoamerica? Well, the shaman in Mesoamerica have for centuries and continue through this day to use stones and other interesting little instruments that they call sastun, which are lightning stones. And you use them sometimes by holding them up to the light. There's various ways that you use them, but the concept is that they allow you to receive inspiration, revelation, understanding from the other sphere. So they function in the same way that seer stones have functioned in other places throughout the world. What is therefore interesting is that we find right at the point where the Book of Mormon is telling us that there is a stone being read by using a stone, which obviously sounds like the Book of Mormon and the seer stone, but it fits in the context. It is something that actually happened in that location. Now, the next thing that happens with Mosiah in the land of Zarahemla is Mosiah, the grandsons. I've got some strange dating here. I wonder what I was thinking when I was putting these slides together. Mosiah will eventually remove the government, and he goes back to judges. What we know of the political situation among the Maya is that they did have these layers of making decision. And although there was a king, there was a hierarchy, the king was there, but the king would always counsel with the family of elders. And they had what they call a popolnach, or a people's house, popol being people, and the nach being a mat, which is a symbol of rulership. And so it's the people's ruling house. And basically, the king would rule in concert with these other rulers. And so what it looks like happens in this area, or in the Book of Mormon, is that he has an organization that's very similar to the organization politically that we see in this region. But what he does is he removes the king off of the top and then just elevates that lower level up to the level of rulership. So this concept of judges, ruling by judges, etc., is very, very similar to what would have gone on before. The difference is the king has been removed. So it's plausible. It comes from a later point in time. So it comes from Chichen Itza, and the data from there are coming much later, more to the time of the conquest. But in Chichen Itza, they had this Multepa type of government, which was much more a rulership by groups and clans. So there was at least some continuation of the concept or some independent invention. But the point is that in this area of the world, there was no unique thing that happened in the shift in government in the Book of Mormon. That wasn't a totally unusual kind of thing. It was simply removing a layer and allowing the rest of the layers to escalate up. Okay, King Benjamin's speech is fascinating. I'm really fascinated, particularly by the introduction to his speech. And the reason for that is the introduction does things that you don't expect. And so you want to know why. Anytime you get something that's unusual, you should be asking yourself, well, why did he do that? So let's go through a few of them. This is Mosiah 2, chapter 2, verses 10 to 13. I have not commanded you to come up hither that ye should fear me, or that ye should think that I of myself am more than a mortal man. Okay, very first thing, right off the bat, King Benjamin comes out and he says, by the way, I'm going to tell you things you shouldn't be thinking. Why start with the negative? Why reverse that? Well, if you are in that area of the world, there is an expectation of kingship. And you remember, of course, that you have a king because it was being developed in the Maya culture at that time. There are cultures all around who have kingship, and the people knew what was to be expected of a king. And there were two things to be expected. One of them was that you should fear the king, but not fear in that the king is going to do something bad to you. You fear them because they are more than a man. They will put themselves in as equivalent to deity. So one of the things that would happen frequently among the Maya is that the king would wear the headdress and the garb and the mask of a certain god. And during the time period when he is performing in the garb of the god, he becomes the god. And so why does Benjamin say, don't think I'm any more than a man? It's because he is trying to teach that principle that he is different from what they might have as an expectation based on everyone else. And he says, yeah, you may think that because of everybody else, but not with me. I'm not here to tell you that I'm more than a man. Verse 11. But I am, like yourselves, subject to all manner of infirmities in body and mind, yet I have been chosen by this people and consecrated by my Father, and was suffered by the hand of the Lord that I should be a ruler and a king over this people, and have been kept and preserved by his matchless power to serve you with all might, mind, and strength, which the Lord hath granted unto me. So nice standard statement there. Verse 12. I say unto you that as I have been suffered to spend my days in your service, even up to this time, and have not sought gold nor silver nor any manner of riches of you. Now there's the important one, because all of the other kings are going to be doing that. Now, side note, what that tells us also is that we should not expect the city of Zarahemla, at least at this time period, to be as spectacular as the other ones. Because the spectacular cities come because of the taxation, because of the gold and silver and the wealth that the king pulls together to use to be able to build the cities. And what Benjamin is saying, I'm not doing that. I didn't tax you. I didn't take your money. And so they have a simpler form of government. He may be a king, but he's not that far elevated, not that far different. So neither have I suffered that you should be confined in dungeons. Okay, why do you say to someone, I haven't thrown you in prison, unless that was a real possibility? You know, if I say, look, I have never slapped any of you with a wet noodle, you're going, well, yeah, that's pretty much true. But it makes no difference. It only makes a difference if there is a possibility that those kinds of things would be going on around you. Nor that I should make slaves one of another, nor that you should murder or plunder or steal or commit adultery, nor even have I suffered that you should commit any manner of wickedness, and have taught that you should keep the commandments of the Lord in all things which he hath commanded you. Now, that list of things that I haven't made you do are all elements that we know existed in Mesoamerica. Now, some of them, again, based on the way we can collect data, some of the data on those will give us later time periods, like prisons. I think the evidence for prisons is a little later. But since we have no texts, we have to wait for the visual evidence to show up. What we can say about these cultures and about agricultural cultures in general is that they tend to be pretty conservative and they don't change very rapidly. So if we do find something 500 years later, it really isn't a stretch to suppose that it could have been present 500 years earlier, because they don't change that fast. Now, of course, living in the world we live in just unthinkable change, but the ancient world did not change as fast as we are changing. And so staying relatively the same for 400 or 500 years was not a different problem at all. Okay. Now, we move from there into the Book of Alma. Now, the Book of Alma is still going to be in Zarahemla, but the time period, of course, is getting closer to the time of Christ. And so now, what are we going to find? Well, one of the things that we find that's really fascinating in the Book of Alma is that we get a story of Alma, and particularly the sons of Mosiah, that are leaving Zarahemla and going back to the land of Nephi to preach to the Lamanites who are there. So they leave the Zarahemla homeland and they go back. Now, when they go back, we get a description of Lamanite culture. This is the first time in the Book of Mormon where we actually get descriptions of what people are doing who are Lamanites and not Nephites. So we don't get the Nephites complaining about what the Nephites are doing. We're now talking about seeing something happening in a Lamanite world, which is different from the way things worked in the Nephite world, and we learned some new things about it. So the first one, we've got horses, chariots, and state visits. So we have, of course, the story of Ammon, and I'll get to the story of Ammon and the water of Sebus, probably next week. But we start off with horses and chariots. I've talked before about the fact that it is highly likely that we're seeing translation anachronisms when we see the word horse or chariot, because we never see them doing enough to tell us whether they are our conception of a horse or a chariot. Even that concept of chariot, we get the mental conception very quickly that a chariot should have two wheels, because that's what we're most familiar with. But there are several of the archaeologists in the area who have talked about the chariot, and it's a four-wheel vehicle. And in this case, it's the little toys that you get. So we never have found a full-size wheeled vehicle, but we have found small wheeled vehicles. But the important part of this is, what it says is that the horses and the chariots are being prepared. And in the context, we find out why they're being prepared. They're being prepared two different times. The very first time that Ammon is preparing them, the king is getting ready to go to a feast that his father is putting on. And so it is a very formal visit. It's he is a king, but he's going to his father, who's the king over kings. And so he's on this state visit from one formal king to another. And so the horses and chariots are being prepared. The next time we see them is when he goes to, and of course now the land has totally slipped my mind, but where the other brothers of the sons of Mosiah are, and they're trapped in that land. And Limhi says, we'll go there and we'll meet with this guy who's a friend of mine, and I'll help you release your brothers. And so they prepare the horses and chariots again. So the context in which we see horses and chariots are, first of all, not at all military, but secondly, highly formal state visits. Now, this is another one where the evidence is coming from after the fact, because again, we just don't have the data from this early. But the information from after the fact, as we start to see these cities develop and we get the monumental architecture and the scenery that is being carved into stone. And the trick there is that it's being carved into stone because that's an area that sort of ate up all of the painted works. Even the stone things used to be highly painted, and now most of the paint is gone. But the carving in stone remained. So when they get them carved in stone, we have multiple scenes where we have these formal visits. And the formal visit will always have somebody in a litter being carried. So the litter and the chariot might be the two things. They're usually accompanied by some sacred animals, and that may be the correlation we're getting, to whatever the horse was. But it really looks like, because of the context, we can see some of these images and say, that's what they're talking about. So the language may be from Joseph Smith's era, but what they're describing and what they're talking about based on the context is what we're seeing in these Maya state visits. The next thing is just the political organization. One of the things we learn is that the Lamanites are politically much more sophisticated than the Nephites. They have multiple kings, and they have a king over kings. And so their layering of cities, their formality. What's fascinating is before this time, during this time, and even after, the the prejudices of the Nephites are to say that the Lamanites are lazy and idol mongers, and then when we see them in action, they're much more complicated. So one of the things that is highly likely is that when we go down and we see the architecture, the old concept from tour guides that all the pretty things were Nephite and the ugly ones were Lamanite, probably flipped on its ear. The really cool stuff was probably Lamanite. The Nephite stuff was probably not nearly as exciting as what was going on in the Lamanite world. Now, we get to time correlations, and I think this is where I'm going to end today. We want to talk about the end of the Book of Mormon. So what happens in the ending of the Book of Mormon is we shift both time and place. So time, of course, is going to get closer to AD 400. And the location is up around this narrow neck. Now that's important because they go through this narrow neck. They go back and forth through it. They talk about defending the narrow neck, and they will have Bountiful as a city which is going to defend the entrance into the lands northward. So they go back and forth through here, but everything has moved up. You don't even have Zarahemla in the picture anymore. That has become thoroughly Lamanite by the time of the demise. So this is the area of the world, and now what's happening in this area of the world, and particularly at this time, that is going to lead someone to want to destroy the Nephites. Well, Mormon tells us, and he's very, very clear about why the Nephites are destroyed. Obviously, one of the reasons why the Nephites are being destroyed is because of unrighteousness. And it is one of the themes that Mormon repeats frequently in the Book of Mormon, this promise of the land that if you obey the commandments, you'll be prospered in the land, and if you don't, you'll be destroyed off the land. Well, this is being destroyed off the land. So Mormon has said that multiple times. But he doesn't leave it there, because he knows, and Mormon is writing the Book of Mormon during the time when all this is happening. Mormon knows who is destroying him, but he writes the history to see how it develops so that people will understand. And what he does is he creates these Gadianton robbers. Now, when I say he creates them, please don't think that I'm saying he invented them whole cloth. That is not true. What he did was take groups that were already there, give them a label, and then as they reappear over time, they get the same label. So it sounds like they're the same people, even though they probably weren't, because they go in and out of history, starting in the Book of Helaman, but they don't destroy the Nephites until we get to the Book of Mormon in the Book of Mormon. So he gets the Gadiantons in there, but he will make sure that he ties the Gadiantons to the Jaredites. Well, why would he do that? Well, the Jaredites were destroyed people. So how does he do this? He places them in the land northward. In Helaman, he gives some very specific instructions about the land northward, and we talked about these in geography, where there's a very specific set of things where you have to have many waters and devoid of trees. It has to be north. He's pointing to the city of Teotihuacan. And he's pointing to them because Mormon knows that in his time period, it is this presence of Teotihuacan that he blames for the demise of the Nephites. Now, Gadianton and Teotihuacan, Mormon makes that connection. Why does that matter? Well, in 378, AD 378, we have a text in Tikal that talks about what's called the Entrada, which is the time when Teotihuacan has come down from central Mexico, down through the narrow neck of land, and has come in, and depends on how you want to talk about it, but basically conquers Tikal. And then from that base, they spread out, and Tikal Teotihuacan becomes very dominant throughout that region. And it becomes a time period of political or military unrest because we see that a lot of fortresses are being built at this point in time, etc. Well, what's happening is Teotihuacan is establishing ties economically from central Mexico, which is north of where the Nephites are, to Tikal and lowland Guatemala, which is where the Lamanites are, but south of the Nephites. And the Nephites are now crammed into this land around the narrow neck of land that you have to go through in order to make trade. So all of a sudden, for the first time in Nephite history, they're in a position that is economically threatening to peoples who are strong enough that they can do something about it. And so they decide that it is now economically viable to get rid of the Nephites, to remove this threat to their trade and remove them. And so what happens is the Nephi or the Gadiantons, Teotihuacanos coming down, and the Lamanites gather together. And if you read in Mormon, it becomes really fascinating because at the beginning he says his father takes him down to Zarahemla, and his father's a military man, and they have victories against the Lamanites. And then apparently his father's dead because we don't hear about him. Mormon gets elevated to the position of leadership, and he leads his people against the Lamanites who are coming in just the same way that they had done not too long before, in which they had been victorious not too long before. And what happens this time is he said, and we saw among them the Gadiantons, and because they saw the Gadiantons, they turned tail and ran. So here's a people who have been defeating Lamanites for 1,000 years. And all of a sudden, Gadiantons show up and they're going, oh, okay, goose is cooked. And they turn around and flee. And it takes a long time for them to be able to establish themselves to get some of those temporary reprieves. So it is right at this point in time in Mesoamerican history where there is a historical reason for understanding why the Nephites would be eliminated at this point in time, not 100 years earlier, not 100 years later. Why at this point in time, and because the Nephites have moved to that location, all of those factors move in to be able to say this is the reason why the Nephites were destroyed at that time. Okay, this is the place where I'm going to stop. We'll pick up third session on this next week. So thanks for listening. Have yourself a good week.